The rain was coming down in sheets that night, the kind that blurs the world outside into a watercolor of gray and black. I was curled up in my armchair in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book, the only light in the room coming from my reading lamp. Our house has these big, old-fashioned picture windows that look out onto the front yard, usually a nice feature, but tonight they just felt exposed. A sudden flash of lightning split the darkness, illuminating the yard for a split second. In that brief, stark light, I saw it, a vague human figure standing just beyond the edge of the porch. It was blurry, distorted by the rain, but there was definitely someone out there, facing the house. The thunder rumbled a moment later, and I told myself it was just a neighbor, maybe forgot their umbrella. But the rain intensified, drumming against the glass, and the figure didn't move. It remained there, still and silent, as if it were watching the house. Another lightning strike, and this time I saw it more clearly. The silhouette of a person, their head tilted slightly, as if they were looking directly at the window where I was sitting. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my book, but the feeling of being watched was persistent. Finally, I got up and drew the heavy curtains closed, a small act of defiance against the unseen observer. But even behind the thick fabric, I could still feel a presence outside, a sense of eyes lingering on the house. Deciding I was being paranoid, I grabbed my phone, intending to record a short video of the empty yard through the window to prove to myself there was nothing there. I held my phone up, aimed at the rain-streaked glass, and pressed record. A few minutes passed, the only sound the relentless drumming of the rain and the faint hum of my phone. When I replayed the video, the screen showed exactly what I expected, a blurry, dark expanse with nothing discernible in the downpour. Relief washed over me, brief and fragile. I lowered my phone and glanced back at the window. That's when I saw it. Pressed against the glass, about halfway up, was a smear. It looked like a handprint, but distorted, as if made by someone pressing their palm against the wet surface and then slowly dragging it downwards. A knot of genuine fear tightened in my chest. I had definitely not seen that before. My breath hitched. I had to know if the figure was still out there. With trembling hands, I inched the curtain open just a crack. The figure was closer now, standing right at the edge of the porch. The rain still obscured details, but its face was almost pressed against the glass. And then the lightning flashed again. This time I saw enough. The face was gaunt, the features stretched and unnatural, and a slow, unsettling smile stretched across its lips. The smile seemed to be directed right at the handprint on the window. I stumbled backward, a strangled scream caught in my throat. I scrambled away from the window, falling to the floor. For a long moment, I just lay there, heart pounding. The image of that distorted face burned into my mind. Finally, I forced myself to look back at the window. The figure was gone. Only the relentless rain and the smeared handprint remained on the glass. I didn't sleep a wink that night, every creak of the house sounding like footsteps, every gust of wind like a whispered breath against the window pane. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving a sodden, gray landscape. I went to the window, my legs still shaky. The handprint was still there, stark against the clean glass. I touched it tentatively. It felt cold and strangely slick. I've tried to rationalize it 100 times. The rain playing tricks on my eyes. A branch scraping the window. But the handprint remains unexplained. And sometimes, especially on rainy nights, I still get that chilling feeling of being watched. And I can't help but wonder what kind of smile was meant for that mark on the glass. I was home alone that night, the kind of torrential downpour outside that makes the windows rattle and the world feel swallowed by the darkness. Suddenly, above the relentless drumming of the rain, I heard it, a faint, muffled sob. It seemed to be coming from upstairs, from the direction of the attic. A shiver of unease snaked down my spine. There was no one else in the house. My parents were away for the weekend, and I was supposed to have the place to myself. I strained my ears, trying to discern the sound over the storm. It came again, a little clearer this time, a choked, desperate cry that sent a prickle of goosebumps down my arms. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or the old house settling. But the sound persisted, a sporadic, heart-wrenching whimper that burrowed its way into my thoughts. I checked the downstairs rooms, the kitchen, the living room, all empty. The only way up was the narrow staircase leading to the second floor, and then the pull-down ladder to the attic. The crying started again, a little louder, laced with what sounded like genuine distress. I had to check. The attic door, a plain wooden panel in the upstairs hallway ceiling, was always locked. I vaguely remembered my dad locking it after storing some old boxes up there months ago. The key? No idea where it was. I rummaged through drawers in the hallway table, my anxiety growing with each passing moment. Finally, tucked away in the back of a dusty jewelry box, my fingers brushed against a small, tarnished key. It looked old, but something told me it was the one. As I cautiously approached the attic door, the crying abruptly stopped. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the rain. Then a new sound emerged, a faint but utterly unsettling scratching noise from above. It sounded like something with claws dragging itself across the wooden floor of the attic. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the keyhole. The scratching continued, a slow, deliberate rasp that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the attic door and slowly, reluctantly pulled it open. A gust of cold, musty air wafted down, carrying with it the faint scent of damp wood and something else, something metallic. The attic was pitch black. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a dusty, cluttered space filled with forgotten furniture draped in white sheets and stacks of cardboard boxes. There was no one there. Relief washed over me, weak and fleeting. I swept the beam of my phone around the attic, confirming it was empty. Just as I started to lower my phone, ready to dismiss the sounds as my overactive imagination, the screen flickered violently. For a split second, in the dying light of the battery, I saw it. A small, shadowy figure huddled in the far corner, its limbs contorted at unnatural angles. Then the phone went black. Panic seized me. I stumbled backward, slamming the attic door shut and fumbling with the lock. The crying started again, this time right on the other side of the door, clear and agonizing, accompanied by the frantic, scraping sound I'd heard earlier. It sounded like something was desperately trying to get out. I didn't think. I just ran. I fled down the stairs, out the front door, and into the raging storm. I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's house, soaked to the bone and gasping for breath. I spent the rest of the night there, huddled on their couch, unable to speak coherently about what I'd heard and seen. I never went back to that house alone. My parents found nothing in the attic, just old boxes and dust. But to this day, I can still hear that muffled cry and the chilling scrape of something crawling in the darkness above. And I'll never forget the fleeting glimpse of that twisted figure in the dying light of my phone. I still have no idea what was up there or what it wanted, but the thought of it still makes the rain feel like a threat. The rain was relentless that night, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the window panes, isolating me in the quiet hum of the house. I'd finally drifted off to sleep, the kind of deep slumber that comes after a long week, when a sharp, insistent knocking jolted me awake. My heart pounded a confused rhythm as I fumbled for my phone to check the time. 2:37 a.m. Who would be knocking at this hour in this downpour? Groggily, I made my way to the front door, peering through the peephole. Standing on my porch, drenched and still, was Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor from across the street. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe she needed help. But then a prickle of unease followed. Mrs. Henderson was a sweet, if somewhat frail, woman in her late 80s. She'd never bother anyone this late, especially in such terrible weather. And her posture, it was stiff, almost unnatural. Her head was slightly bowed, and her arms hung limply at her sides. I unlocked the deadbolt, a hesitant Mrs. Henderson, on my lips, but caught myself before opening. Her knocking continued, a steady, almost frantic rhythm now, and her head remained bowed, her face obscured by the shadows and the rain. Her eyes, the small sliver I could see, looked empty, void of the usual kind twinkle. A knot of genuine worry tightened in my chest. Something was wrong. I fumbled for my phone again and tried to call her son, Michael. He lived a few towns over. The phone rang and rang, but went straight to voicemail. I tried her landline, the same result. "Mrs. Henderson, are you all right?" I called through the closed door, my voice laced with concern. She didn't respond, the relentless knocking her only answer. It was starting to feel less like a neighbor needing help and more like something else. I moved to the living room window, peering through the gap in the curtains. The porch light cast long, distorted shadows. I watched her for a few minutes. Her stance was rigid, her body swaying almost imperceptibly. The rain plastered her thin white hair to her skull, and water streamed down her face. Yet she didn't flinch, didn't even blink. It was as if she were a statue animated by some unseen force, her sole purpose to beat on my door. Then I noticed something that sent a fresh wave of icy dread through me. The rhythm of her knocking. It was familiar, terribly familiar. I tried to place it, my mind racing through years of mundane sounds. And then it hit me. That exact rhythm, that specific pattern of 3 quick raps followed by a pause, then 2 more. It was the way my mother used to knock. A distinct, almost impatient pattern she'd had for as long as I could remember. My mother, who had passed away 5 years ago. My breath hitched. It couldn't be. It was just a coincidence, my mind playing tricks on me in the middle of the night. But the unsettling feeling intensified, a cold dread seeping into my bones. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a growing sense of terror, I edged back to the door. My hand trembled as I slowly, silently, slid the chain lock and cracked the door open just a sliver. "Mrs. Henderson?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the rain. Her head slowly, mechanically lifted. Her eyes, when they finally focused on mine, were wide and vacant, like 2 dark pools. And then she spoke. Her voice was raspy, strained, utterly unlike the gentle, high-pitched voice I knew. "Child," she croaked, the sound alien and chilling, "let me in. It's so cold out here." The words themselves weren't particularly frightening, but the voice, it was undeniably my mother's. Not perfectly mimicked, but the same timbre, the same inflection on the last word. My blood ran cold. I slammed the door shut and bolted the locks, my hands shaking so violently I could barely manage it. I pressed my eye back to the peephole, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The porch was empty. The rain still poured down, washing the concrete clean. Mrs. Henderson was gone. I stumbled to the window again, my gaze sweeping across the street. There, standing under the flickering streetlight at the edge of her driveway, was Mrs. Henderson. She was talking to a man I recognized as her son, Michael, their faces illuminated by the street lamp. They looked perfectly normal, concerned even, as if she'd simply wandered over in the storm. I didn't understand. The empty eyes, the mechanical movements, the familiar knock, the voice, what had just happened on my doorstep. The rain continued its relentless assault, each drop a reminder of the chilling encounter with the familiar stranger at my door. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, listening to the storm, the unsettling question echoing in my mind. Who or what had been knocking? And why did it sound so much like my mother?